But after Prigozhin's death, we did see an increase in Russian PMC operations. They've deployed officially to two new countries. They're operating now in Burkina Faso and also in Niger. There's been a number of cases in which Russian PMCs have carried out violence against Chinese miners or pushed them out from operating in certain areas.
Hello and welcome back to The Focus. Once a shadowy force that helped shape global conflicts, the Wagner Group is now shattered, its remnants absorbed into Russia's military machine. But with the ghost of Prigozhin still looming large a year after his untimely death, what does the future hold for his infamous mercenary empire? Join us on The Focus as we dive into the murky world of post-Wagner Russia with Dr. Serwat, uncovering the hidden power struggles, strategic shifts, and the new face of Russian paramilitary might in the wake of Prigozhin's demise, right here on The Focus. Lad, welcome to The Focus.
Thank you so much for having me.
Lad, in your view, how has the Russian state effectively dismantled the Wagner Group, and what key factors contributed to this process?
Yeah, it's certainly been an interesting year after Prigozhin's death, seeing much of the key leadership replaced by key figures in the Ministry of Defense. Many of the various contracts that were given to Wagner now given to other PMCs, still kind of falling under this broader, now called Africa Corps umbrella. But we do see a bit of dismembering of that network, and some of that is still under process. We're still seeing certain people that were in sort of middle management positions at a country level replaced. Some of the contracts in the Central African Republic are quite complex due to Prigozhin's vast business empire there and all of the sort of natural and mineral sort of wealth and resources that were under Prigozhin's sort of business empire. So yeah, it's certainly been a process over the past year. We have seen a lot of what was Wagner kind of shift into these new contracts, but at the same time, there's still quite a legacy of Wagner, and we see, much of the country level and local reporting still referring to sort of Wagner Group. Many local people, especially in Africa, are still calling Russian mercenaries, Wagner Group. So we still see that legacy, although much has shifted and changed.
Led, I hate to ask you this, but for our audience who may not be familiar with the term, what actually is a PMC?
Yeah, PMC refers to a private military company. These can take a number of different forms, but they tend to differ from, say, a private security company in offering, say, security services where you might have a security guard, much more defensive. A PMC is going to engage much more in sort of offensive military operations. Sometimes directly, other times in a more supportive role to a host government or to whatever other armed group they might be working alongside.
Awesome. Thank you for that. With Wagner's forces now reportedly integrated into units like the National Guard and other military units, do you think this has strengthened or weakened Russia's paramilitary capabilities?
It's a great question. I would say in some ways we've seen a strengthening because they are now kind of within the Ministry of Defense. That has likely come with some expanded capabilities for the group. Some further integration into the military may come with access to certain equipment that wasn't available before. It may come with further experience at the sort of top level. However, I would say that some of the advantages that Russia was given by kind of working with a very separate group are a bit more difficult. I mean, at the moment, Russia can still kind of point to various PMC victories and say, this is us, this is great, this is Russian foreign policy at its finest. But at the same time, there's so much more connection between the various PMCs and the Russian Ministry of Defense that when there are losses, it's difficult to say this was as far removed as Wagner was a year or 2 years ago.
There's been a discussion about Wagner's fragmented troops being absorbed into various factions like Rosgardia and Chechen forces. How do you assess the impact of this fragmentation on Wagner's operational culture? Are people who are part of Wagner still proud of their association and wear it as a badge of honor?
I think from what we can tell, there is still a sense of pride in working with these various PMCs. I mean, following, especially in the last few days, the Bear PMC, which has been deployed to Burkina Faso, they've kind of worked and developed a bit of a culture. There's, a social media presence. They are sort of trying to project that same image that we saw from Wagner. And I don't think we see that to the same extent, in a place like Central African Republic, especially. I mean, Wagner was wildly popular. We saw, many civilians even demonstrating with various Wagner symbols and things. So I don't think they've reached sort of that same level of popularity at a local level. But within the PMC, and coming back to your question, I think there still is within the Africa mercenaries, at least that I pay attention to. And uh, yeah, I mean, not to the same extent, but we do still see that from what we can observe.
Lad, given that the Wagner Group was once a valuable tool for Russia's geopolitical ambitions, especially in Africa, how does the emergence of the Africa Corps signal a shift in Moscow's strategy on the continent?
Well, it's certainly been a shift in leadership and at the top level. We've seen the Africa Corps, unlike Wagner, kind of come under key figures within the Ministry of Defense, within some certain areas of intelligence. So we have seen that strategic shift for the Africa Corps, which was quite unlike Wagner. Uh, we also have seen some continuity, I think, within Mali. Much of the same kind of middle management have been in place. They've remained relatively similar. And I think from an operational perspective, though, we have to take into account uh, that Africa Corps, call it post-Prigozhin Wagner, or however we want to create that distinction, has increased operations throughout Africa, and that has primarily been driven by their operations in Mali. But after Prigozhin's death, we did see an increase in Russian PMC operations. They've deployed officially to two new countries. They're operating now in Burkina Faso and also in Niger. However, as I mentioned with the Bear PMC just today, they mentioned that they're pulling those troops back. They say they're going to Crimea due to the situation there. We don't know yet if that's due to the Ukrainian offensive into Russia or for some other reason, but at least some of the mercenaries that are operating now in Burkina Faso will be withdrawn. We've also seen a number of concerning kind of cross-border events in the last year since Prigozhin's death. So with with that, we've seen the sort of push in the Malian offensive with various Russian PMCs working alongside the military there against Jenim, an insurgent group operating in the country. And that's even gone as far as pushing into Mauritania. So that's quite concerning, as well as some cross-border violence from Central African Republic into Chad. So this is the sort of expansion that we've seen in the last year, call that strategic. I think some of it has been very context driven, such as the the fight over Kidal, some of the northward offensive in Mali, which has sort of certainly escalated the violence that Russian PMCs have been involved with. But the last year have certainly seen some changes in this transition to Africa Core.
When we talk about Russian PMCs in Africa, what are the numbers involved? I mean, you just made mention of the fact that, Putin's considering repositioning some of the mercenary forces in Africa back into Ukraine to take care of the Kursk salient. Fine, but are we looking at really big numbers here, or are we just looking at a handful of people? Because, there's got to be a limit by which Russia can start throwing around paramilitary and military forces, surely.
Well, it's in the Burkina Faso example, and this is the group that we're more familiar with mentioning the withdrawal. There have only been a reported 100 mercenaries operating there, so that contingent is quite small. We've seen well over 1,000 in places like Mali or Central African Republic. Troop numbers do change, so that can vary from month to month for sure. But over 1,000, over 2,000 at various points in these contexts like CAR and Mali, where they've been very active in direct violence. And then it's much harder to say in places like Libya, where they're in a more supportive role. They're not as engaged directly, so reporting is rather limited. And we know that they're sort of using places in Libya, their strategic bases there to support the RSF in Sudan. We know they're kind of using their Libya bases to support CAR and Mali elsewhere. But in terms of troop numbers there, it's yeah, more difficult to know on a month-to-month basis. But yeah, in short, we see as little as 100 in places like Niger, Burkina Faso, but then thousands in other areas.
So basically, we're not looking at militarily significant numbers, significant enough to support governments in Africa, but not significant enough to turn the tide of the war in Ukraine.
Yeah, I would say they're relatively small. We're not looking at vast numbers of mercenaries, nothing like Russia used in, or rather, I should say, Wagner used in Ukraine around Bakhmut with, thousands of recruits from prisons and things, relatively untrained. In Africa, they're mostly much more trained, ex-military, more experienced, and this sort of thing. So. Yeah, I think the main question though is the difference in capabilities that we see these mercenaries bringing to host governments. And so with the additional technological capacity that is brought, we've with ACLED recorded a rise in say various forms of explosives or use of remote violence, the Wagner capacity to utilize things like helicopters to drop explosives. So in that way, we've seen the sort of technological advantages over other armed groups that they're contesting, whether that's rebel groups in CAR or insurgent groups in Mali. Those are the sort of ways in which they have shifted the conflict dynamics more so than troop numbers on its own.
Give us some idea of the quality of the troops involved in the Africa Corps. Now, we talk about relatively small numbers in terms of being able to sort of manage certain little bush wars, if you like, and supporting various governments in Africa. But I was under the impression that a lot of the people who had a choice to sign contracts to go off and fight for the Africa Corps or go off and fight in Ukraine opted for the soft option being going to the Africa Corps because you're not going to be seeing frontline duty and there's a lot of standing around in Africa in the sun and getting a tan. Now, I mean, I know it sounds awfully facetious, but can you give us an idea of the quality of the forces that we're seeing in the Russian PMCs in Africa? Is there some truth to what I've just said?
Well, as I mentioned, I think the Africa Corps, former Wagner mercenaries, they're part of a number of smaller PMCs, and so those do kind of tend to vary. But the recruits often within Africa have much more experience than we saw in Ukraine. However, I think there's some limitations to this. We often see an escalation in civilian targeting when Russian mercenaries are operating in a particular country, and that's a large concern. I think some of the civilian targeting is due to their inexperience, their inability to distinguish between combatant and civilian populations. We also see them doing sort of concerning, or certainly you wouldn't expect them to be ordered to do this from sort of senior management, but sort of looting from local populations, or this sort of theft and kind of informal taxation, things that all seem to indicate that although they might have some experience, there's sort of a culture or some flexibility for them to engage in sort of violence against civilians and in civilian targeting, which is concerning. Are they well trained? Perhaps, but these are the sort of concerns that I have when looking at their experience, or how well they're operating in a particular context.
Well, I suppose you don't have to be particularly experienced to go into an unarmed population and start shooting. So I suppose that pretty much answers its own question there. But
Yeah,
look,
yeah, absolutely.
yeah, yeah. I was just wondering, with regard to Sudan. Now, Sudan is a country that doesn't get a lot of traction in the public domain, unfortunately. And we see some absolutely horrific warfare going on in
Mm,
that country. I mean, at the moment, the international media is obviously focused on Ukraine, it's focused on the Taiwan Straits, it's certainly
mm,
focused on the Middle East. But, in Sudan, which would potentially be the breadbasket of pretty much all of North Africa and the Middle East, it is a bloody war zone. Obviously, this would be rich pickings for organizations like the Wagner Group and other various private military companies from Russia. You've got poor governance, open spaces. There's a lot of room to maneuver to create a footprint. How do you see the various Russian PMCs approaching Sudan specifically in that chaotic warfare that we're seeing on the ground there?
I would, it's sort of interesting in that they've been operating in a way I might not expect. Kind of as you said, there's such rich opportunity to engage, and we know that Wagner Prigozhin had various contracts in gold in the country. I think there's been some oil extraction that Prigozhin was linked with. So we knew there was this ongoing relationship, and then when the war kicked off, we saw Wagner providing some military equipment to the RSF. So we saw that sort of more supportive role initially, and kind of throughout subsequent months into the war. But we've seen very little engagement directly. And so it doesn't seem that mercenaries are operating kind of on the front lines. They've much more used sort of their base in Libya to provide support to the RSF. So, in a way, they're engaged in the conflict, but much more in that supportive indirect role. The only kind of curious case that we have picked up on was when alleged Ukrainian special forces went into Sudan and used some drone explosives, some RPGs, and uh, engaged directly with Wagner mercenaries in Sudan. So this was kind of widely circulating around Ukrainian media. Others picked up on this, and subsequently there's been some further investigation into that. But ironically, that's one of the few times that we see Wagner, kind of emerge engaged in direct violence in Sudan.
Is there any evidence that the Africa Corps or other elements of the Russian PMC architecture has been outsourced to take care of Chinese commercial enterprises in Africa? I mean, China is a very heavy investor in the continent's infrastructure through its Belt and Road Initiative.
Well, it seems that it may be involved the other way. In Central African Republic, it seems that various Russian PMCs are used quite extensively to guard mining sites, and they've been used at various Prigozhin-linked businesses, mining sites. They've also kind of pushed out miners that are operating, and whether that's artisanally or at industrial sites. And there's been a number of cases in which Russian PMCs have carried out violence against Chinese miners or pushed them out from operating in certain areas. So, if anything, there's not as much coordination as potentially competition. And that's sometimes difficult to know exactly, but seeing some of these violent events might lead one to think there's a bit of contestation in places like Central African Republic that are going against Chinese interests.
That's a little bit of good strategic news to hear. I'm John
Uh,
Bruni, and you're listening to Sage International's The Focus podcast from Los Angeles, California. We're speaking with Dr. Lad Serwat, who's a specialist working on the African region for armed conflict location and event data, also known by its acronym ACLED. Lad, the integration of Wagner forces into official state units suggests an attempt, and I think that you mentioned this before, an attempt by the Kremlin to exert greater control over its paramilitary assets. How might this shift affect Russia's ability to conduct deniable operations abroad?
that's something that we sort of, I think, is very challenging. I think because we have seen such integration into sort of military leadership, intelligence leadership, that sort of deniability is still there. There's still that capacity for, say, Russian leadership to say that, well, this was a failure of a particular PMC and not a direct reflection of, Russian military. If there was, say, Russian soldiers operating in Mali, for example. But it just becomes much more difficult when we see that they're much more integrated. That level of deniability, at least for those of us who are analyzing the group, that just seems like a difficult position to make, even though I think they will continue to use that deniability in the future.
The Africa Corps is said to operate more openly than Wagner. Do you see this as a sign of Russia's growing confidence in its influence in Africa, or could it be a strategic vulnerability?
Well, I do think that it's a strategic change. I think that kind of from around June of last year, of June of 2023, was when we first saw Putin admit to financing the Wagner Group. And I think from that point forward, we saw, more and more admission of their operations together, the further and further cohesion until, the death of Prigozhin and the replacement of many leaders over the past year. So I think that it has been strategic on their part to sort of further show the integration of these various PMCs. And we see kind of various Russian military and political figures making deals or meeting with African leaders, and then the subsequent deployment of Russian PMCs, as we discussed before, like Bayer deploying to Burkina Faso after there were very clear, very open Russian meetings and diplomatic engagement. So in that way, it does seem like a strategic change. They're very open, and really, to me, the vulnerability is just that difficulty to deny the connections between Russian military and these various PMC operations. But that was going away quite a while ago. I mean, although there was that deniability, there was this sort of shroud of mystery over Wagner Group for some years. Within the last, especially year before Prigozhin's death, it was becoming abundantly obvious that this was more and more a tool of Russian foreign policy, that there were linkages between Yevgeny Prigozhin and various key figures in the Russian state. So I think that, maybe they already had the sense that ability to publicly deny their existence was being eroded, and they've just shifted towards this much more public admission of their connection.
Prigozhin's son Pavel is reportedly still involved in Wagner's operations in the Central African Republic. What do you make of his role, and how might it influence Wagner's future in Africa?
Well, it's fascinating that he would be the one working in Central African Republic, mostly because this is where we have such a complex web of Prigozhin-linked businesses. And I've always, sort of thought this transition to other PMCs, to the Russian state, is going to be difficult in Central African Republic because, how does the Russian state decide to replace this kind of complex network of businesses with people that are more aligned with their interests, that's potentially diverting some of those resources away from Prigozhin and former allies of Prigozhin towards the Russian state interest, and that's really fascinating. I think having his son involved there probably speaks to the complexity of that process and the ways in which all of these businesses probably are kind of being changed and transformed over the last year.
Okay, so with regard to Moscow's broader strategic interests in Africa, obviously with international sanctions having been placed on Africa, the idea of Russia having a footprint there in a resource-rich area is a way in which they can, A, circumvent sanctions being placed upon them, extract whatever they need and bring it back. But with regard to Russia's capacity to extract those resources, I mean, I've heard terrible things about the way that Russian airlines are running right now because they're running out of spare parts. And, obviously supporting people in far off places like Africa is going to take a very sophisticated logistics train, both civil and military. But if both are suffering from international sanctions and, the planes aren't flying, not as readily as they once were because whatever's there, whatever's flying is being cannibalized to keep the reduced fleet going. Surely this poses a problem for the Russian presence in Africa?
I mean, I would like to think so or hope so. My specialization is much more on their military operations than their business operations, but um, yeah, I would like to think so. And, from what maybe what we can see is that strategic hubs like Libya have helped facilitate this sort of bypass some of the sanctions. I would, again, I hope that sanctions are making their operations more difficult, but having Libya, their bases in Syria and elsewhere, I do think that they're able to circumnavigate some of those restrictions and continue extracting resources. To your point on their capacity to kind of work efficiently or to utilize these resources well, to transfer those resources back to other operations, as people might suspect, in Ukraine, for example. Um, I really couldn't comment on that specifically, as we're more focused on monitoring their involvement in political violence, um, but yes, I could speak to their logistical bases and know that they've been able to use those in order to extract wealth from various African countries.
Tell me something, lad. How are the local Africans viewing all of this? You've got a continent of people who are quite familiar with colonialism and foreign intervention. I mean, it is part of modern Africa's history. And yet they seem to be quite happy to continue inviting foreigners into their country to fight the colonialists, namely the former Western metropolitan powers that used to run the joint. Um, it's a bit strange, don't you think? Whereas you kind of think that maybe the Africans would have more of a sense of themselves to try to push back from all these foreign influences. Surely they must know that once they get into bed with organizations like, Russian PMCs, that they then fall under their influence. Surely.
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because I think it speaks to this important point on some of the divisions that we see within various African countries. And while we do certainly see, especially in urban areas, the support for Russian PMCs, especially in places like Central African Republic, there's statues that are erected in the capital to Russian mercenaries and everything. People demonstrating kind of, and seeing a lot of the anti-French sentiment mixed in with this. So it's sort of seeing the removal of the French and the anti-colonialism that you mentioned, and seeing kind of Russia as the alternative and the way that they're able to get rid of their former colonial power and having this new security partner. Of course, there's irony in this that, is Russia kind of just filling in the same role that we saw the French doing? And we see quite a lot of evidence of that. However, I think the point that I would want to make is that that every African country has a diverse population, and while there are people living in, say, capital areas, areas in which Wagner has been able to push out insurgents or rebel groups, there has been support. However, we see antagonism and continued mobilization of other armed groups in areas where they haven't been the beneficiary of Wagner's violence, maybe where the host government has continually been depriving of development or continuing to carry out high levels of civilian targeting. These groups are the ones that are not the beneficiaries. They're oftentimes those that have been at the sort of receiving end of a lot of the intense violence by either the military for a long time or now by Russian mercenaries. And so it does vary in each context who those groups might be. We see in Central African Republic groups like people of Muslim faith, Fulani, are often suspected to be maybe recruited by various armed groups and various rebel groups. Therefore, they've been the ones targeted. And I don't think that we're seeing a lot of popularity for Russian PMCs, for Russia, amongst those groups of the population. And so, is there a bit of a urban-rural divide? There's a bit of that. There's also some ethnic and religious dimensions. It varies in each locality, but these are the sort of ways in which the populations are heterogeneous. They are not all in support, while we do have to recognize that some are in favor.
Are groups like Wagner recruiting locals to flesh out their rank and file? We did mention earlier that the actual Russian citizenry involved in Wagner is a relatively low number, and they can't be everywhere in a country the size of, say, Libya or,
Mhm.
look at Mali, for instance. I mean, they're having to cover very long distances, and the only way that they can mitigate against that is by having local proxies flying the Wagner or other Russian PMC flag and doing the dirty on their behalf. Is that their modus operandi?
Well, initially, in some of the earlier operations, especially as violence escalated, late 2020, early 2021, much of the reports kind of talked about these groups because there wasn't actually a lot of clarity on who they were working for, but we saw them mention them by their, nationality or by their ethnicity, sometimes by their color, just calling them white. So at times we would see reports saying Libyan or Syrian or Russian mercenaries. So it seemed that at the early stages that various Wagner-linked PMCs were recruiting from areas where they had operated before. So where they had operated in Syria, where they had operated in Libya. However, as they operated for a longer period of time, not so much in Mali, but especially in CAR, we saw more recruitment of locals. And again, much of the reports on this would simply refer to those local recruits as Black Russians. And that's just the way that much of the reports were describing them. But there was not a lot of clarity to know, are these recruits operating within the organizational structure of these Russian PMCs? Or are they armed groups that were simply equipped, trained, and sent out to do the bidding of one of these PMCs? And what we came to find over time was it was both, that some of them were operating within Russian PMCs under that sort of organizational command structure, and others were armed groups that had been trained, equipped, and sent out to carry out various Russian PMCs work. So those are the two. And of course, the concern is, well, because there have been these armed groups that are trained, equipped, and operating separately, that can really shift the balance of power in local areas. That even if, say, tomorrow the PMC were to leave, we still have a balance of power that's changed and shifted in certain local areas, namely in Kar. So I think that's a bit of a concern, but a notable point in terms of their local recruitment.
All right, I've got to ask you this question, lad. What's with the Nazi symbology here? The Wagner Group, I can see the Ride of the Valkyrie coming through. I can also understand that there might be a bit of a problem with the idea of the Africa Corps, which was first pioneered by the
Yeah.
Nazis.
Hmm.
And of course, that these are archetypal racist organizations we're talking about here, and now they're folded into a Russian PMC outfit dealing with Black Africans in Africa. Is there not some sort of, I don't know, cognitive dissonance going on here? What is the thing that the Russians have with neo-Nazi symbology? Is it a macho thing? Is it because they were really, really tough units that somehow if they had their branding rubbed all over them, somehow people will see them in the same light? What's going on there?
Well, as you mentioned, I mean, on the surface, there's such a grand irony to this that why in the world, especially at a time in which Russia is accusing Ukraine of being this Nazi supporting regime and that they have so much propaganda that they're going into Ukraine to combat this neo-Nazism. But in the meantime, there's been this sort of neo-Nazism that's developed within many of the PMCs, especially within Wagner. And so, there's this kind of how has this kind of developed at the same time, and how have they been able to maintain a coherent messaging to, especially to the Russian population, that we're against Ukraine because of neo-Nazism, yet we are now publicly supporting these various PMCs who openly utilize neo-Nazism within their branding. And, you know, I actually don't have a clear answer for you. I can tell you there was, the interest by some of the Wagner founders by Prigozhin and some of these leaders, Utkin and others for Wagner. We see, as you mentioned, some of the machoism or elitism militarily for Nazi era strategies and for this, but it's very bizarre, and I do wonder, like, how long can this kind of simultaneous public messaging last, because it just seems so incompatible.
Oh, well, it seems so incompatible, especially because they're dealing in Africa. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if I was an educated African, I'd be offended by all of this. But anyway, that's just me.
Hmm.
I mean, I suppose out in the boondoggles where, African understanding of history doesn't go beyond what they know from, what's been passed down from father to son. I understand all of that. But in terms of, the actual history in Europe and North Africa and what it all meant back in, World War II, yeah, it is a very strange look. So, with the ongoing war in Ukraine, lad, how likely are we to see an expansion of the Africa Corps, ergo Wagner, in Africa, a theater very far removed from Vladimir Putin's immediate area of interest?
Well, it seems that this is a really strategic time to talk about this, because while we have some kind of expansion in the last, say, 6 months towards new countries, the deployment into Burkina Faso, into Niger. I think we've seen, just growth across the Sahel in insurgency. And so a number of regimes are kind of moving away from various Western security partnerships, and we're seeing them look to alternatives. And while some of them have, moved towards Rwanda, for example, in Mozambique, and having already tried to partner with Wagner there, and it being a complete failure. At the present, I think we do have an interest, especially in that sort of Sahel region, for Wagner to expand, or sorry, for Russia to expand their influence in that area. However, I think they have to balance their interest in expansion with their capabilities with the war, at their doorstep. And so when we have sort of a Ukrainian offensive moving into Russian territory, I think we'll probably expect that that will limit expansion into, new areas of Africa, or even, as we're seeing, preliminary evidence of today, sort of a withdrawal. So, that's all going to be balanced. I think there's the interest, but there is still the war in Ukraine, and that is going to make a difference. It's going to limit Russia's ability to continue expanding across the continent.
Led, some experts argue that the Wagner Group was pivotal in showing that mercenaries can be successful counterterrorism actors. How do you evaluate the success of this proof of concept, and what implications does it have for future Russian operations?
There were sort of some initial complete losses, and we just mentioned Mozambique. So that was an effort by Mozambique to utilize Wagner to counter the insurgent threat in the north. And unfortunately for the people that are living in that area, the support of Wagner Group was unsuccessful. They were not able to counter that insurgency. I think what we saw then in Central African Republic was, and this has happened on subsequent occasions, there's been various offensives by rebel groups, by local armed groups, sometimes contesting larger areas across the country. And Wagner has been able to support the regime there, of course, alongside various UN and Rwandan special forces to suppress those offensives. That's, of course, come at the cost of many civilian lives due to the amount of civilian targeting by Wagner, but they have been able to counter those offensives. However, we're not seeing that they've been able to counter it for the long term. It's sort of like they've been able to suppress it in the interim, but there's been subsequent waves of these offensives. So there's still the capacity for armed groups to organize, recruit, and arm themselves and carry out another wave of violence. So that's where we've seen the limitations. And in Mali, I don't think we see a lot of success. I mean, the levels of violence, especially with JNIM, continue to escalate quarter after quarter, year after year. And so can we really call their operations successful? I really don't think so. You have to look at specific metrics, of course, but overall, I'm not sure that it's sort of shown itself to be the shining example of a counterinsurgency success. Now, taking that into account, they're going to point to the ability to take back over Kidal, the most recent northward offensive up to the Algerian border. Have those been, have there been a degree of success with these? Yeah, potentially you could say that, but I think it's too early to tell. Will they be able to hold that territory? That's also unclear. Are insurgent groups able to continue carrying out violence even in areas, quote unquote, controlled by the military with Russian PMC support? Again, that's what we haven't seen happen yet, and why I wouldn't call it necessarily a shining example of mercenaries able to support, as you said, host governments to counter insurgency.
I'm thinking that the French couldn't have been really happy to be displaced out of the Sahel in the way that they were. And I think that the Americans might be a little bit twitchy about the whole thing as well. Is there any sense that after this conversation, that we're having, you sense that maybe there's an opportunity for both France and America to sort of push back against Russian interests and influence as destabilizers in the Sahel region and other parts. I mean, if, for instance, what we say is true, that, Putin is withdrawing some forces to take care of Kursk, that provides an opportunity of sorts for France to regain or come back in some capacity, with or without American assistance. The Americans, obviously, at the moment, we just have to wait and see, because they've got their big election coming up, and I don't think that they'd be in the position to toy around with Africa until sometime in 2025. But certainly the French, they're in a better position to reassess and perhaps go back in. Or do you think that France is finished in the Sahel completely?
Well, we really will have to wait and see on this. And I would my hope would be, and that after, some of this time goes by, it's always easy to criticize the hegemonic power, whether, that's France or the US. And in the moment, when various regimes are kind of partnered with and heavily influenced by those hegemonic countries, people can kind of look and criticize. And I think as Russia's now kind of pushed out, or there's been the withdrawal of Western countries in these areas, and much more of Russian PMCs have now become the military ally. I would like to think that they can look back and see the number of civilians killed and the cost of partnership to be great, and in some senses much worse than, say, the French military operations. I think in a recent report that we shared, there were around 100 civilians killed in all of France's operations in Mali, whereas that's, a day in the work of Russian PMCs against civilians. So, I mean, in that sense, I would hope to see that reflection and that change. Um, in in some ways, maybe the Central African Republic could be an example of a rethinking. I think the president Touadera there has been in touch with the American Bancroft PMC, and that has we I don't have too many details on this yet, but has I know he's been in touch with and potentially interested in bringing in an American PMC into the mix. Is that a recognition that they need to diversify away from Russian interests, that Russia's become too involved, and they need a bit more leverage? In CAR, they've sort of done that for a while. They've had Rwandan special forces, they've maintained UN presence. So is that then going to happen in Mali and other places in the Sahel? Well, time will tell, but maybe that example in CAR is one in which there's a bit of a reflection moment after, especially having Russian PMCs involved there for a longer period of time.
Okay, lad, finally, looking at the legacy of Prigozhin and the Wagner Group, how do you think their story will influence the future of private military companies within and outside of Russia?
I think the main story that we're going to be reflecting upon is just the great cost to civilians that bringing in PMCs from outside, as has had a vast impact on civilian populations. We've seen so many civilians killed by PMCs as they're working alongside host governments, and oftentimes even after counteroffensives against various rebel groups with counterinsurgencies. These PMCs have continued to operate in various areas, tried to hold territory, and the number of civilians killed in these areas, I think that's going to be the story that we reflect on, in some years' time.
Dr. Lad Serwat, thanks for joining us and for sharing your insights on the focus.
Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
That was Lad Serwat, African Specialist for the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data, or ACLED, discussing his insights into the post-Prigozhin Wagner Group. Thank you for joining me, John Bruni, for today's episode with Lad Serwat. Check out the links in our show notes to learn more about Lad and connect with him on social media. What do you think about the integration of elements of the Wagner Group into Russia's National Guard and other military units? Does it strengthen or weaken Moscow's control over its paramilitary forces? Will Wagner's presence in Africa be able to maintain the group's influence, or is this the beginning of the end for Wagner? Will the legacy of the Wagner Group shape the future of private military companies in Russia, or will the Kremlin's tighter control lead to their decline? Let us know in the comments section below. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. It's a free way to support us. You can also subscribe to the podcast on the Ozcast Network, iTunes, and Spotify, where we would appreciate your 5-star reviews. If you have any comments or questions about the podcast, post them in the comments section on YouTube, and I'll do my best to respond to as many as I can. My thanks, as ever, to producers of The Focus, Malcolm Hughes and Neil Smart. Please stay connected with us on social media. Follow me on X at BruniDoctor and follow the Focus on X at @thefocus_sage. From Adelaide, South Australia, you've been listening to The Focus.